Recently on this channel, I did a video about the worst PC operating systems of all time, as voted for by the general retro computing community in a few of the big Facebook groups, and no spoilers if you haven't watched it yet, but unsurprisingly, Windows Me scored pretty highly on that list. But since it celebrated its 20th anniversary a couple of months ago in September, and that seemed to slip by uncelebrated by many people, unsurprisingly, I thought it might be worth a bit of a closer look at this much maligned version of Windows. Now, I've got this cheap old eMachines PC from around early 2002, and as you can see, I've already prepared it with a Windows Me sticker, so I guess that means we're going to have the full early 2000s experience of an eMachines computer running Windows Me. What have I let myself in for? So in this video, we'll get it installed, get it set up with a bunch of software and games from the time, and see how well it holds up using it as an operating system 20 years later, whether it really is as unstable as people make out, and also a few tweaks and programs that will help with that. Now, just before we get into that, I wanted to take a moment to say a big thank you to you. As you know, someone who's actually a freelance worker, the fact that this year I've been able to dedicate 20 to 40 hours to make these videos for you, which is about how long an average video of mine takes to put together. And that's because of your support of this channel's brilliant sponsors. And today's video is brought to you by my very good friends at Raid Shadow Legends. Now, Raid Shadow Legends is a AAA quality fantasy combat game that you can play anywhere, on your phone, on the move, or on your PC. And I love how much is in this game too. There are over 500 different champions to collect, all with their own skill trees and millions of artifacts to find and equip. No two champions will ever be the same. And obviously that means there are literally trillions of ways to play this game, endless strategies and ways to build up your teams. Now, what I really like about Raid Shadow Legends is just how accessible the game is. I mean, obviously there are heaps of characters in here as well, but it's so easy just to jump right in and get started. And they're constantly upgrading it and adding new features all the time, like the Artifact Forge, where you can save loads of time and craft artifacts directly. As well as a whole new advanced quest system with amazing rewards as well. And that's not all, they've also brought out some brilliant new champions, and right now they're developing the amazing looking Doom Tower. So you need to jump right in and just get started now, and they've made it so welcoming for new players as well. Now, if you check out my special links in this video description, you'll get 100,000 silver and 1 energy refill and 10 mystery shards and a free champion, Slasher. So all this lovely treasure will be waiting for you right here. So good luck, and I will see you there on Raid Shadow Legends. Okay, so let's get to installing Windows Me on this eMachines budget PC. Now, I've got to say, actually, while it's installing, this PC is quite nostalgic for me, as this was a cheap Facebook Marketplace find a few months ago. But actually, it is quite similar to my first ever Windows PC that I got back in summer of 1999. Now, that was also a Celeron-powered machine, clocked in at around a gigahertz, if I remember correctly, maybe just under, with 128 megabytes of RAM. I had a 5 gigabyte hard disk in there as well. My parents bought this machine for me, trust me, I didn't spec it myself. But this was actually the closest thing I could find to it. And even though it is a couple of years later, this machine, it does actually look very similar. And this PC has got a much faster 1.7 gigahertz Celeron processor. It's got 128 megabytes of DDR RAM, which was, pretty standard for the time. And it also came with a CD rewriter drive that can apparently, according to the stickers on the front, also play DVDs, even though there is no mention of DVDs on the actual drive. So that will be interesting to test out. And we've got a standard PC floppy drive in the center as well. A 56k modem, an Ethernet included, and apparently 3D AGP Intel Extreme graphics on board. I mean, in all, this wasn't really a bad entry-level PC for the early 2000s, and I'd imagine this is one of the higher-end machines in the eMachines budget PC range. And on the front of it, we have a USB port and a game port as well, which is handy, having them so accessible on the front of the machine, even though the cover has gone missing on this one. And even though these were pretty cheap and nasty, you would find them in all your usual places like Dixon's and PC World. They'd be really prevalent back in the early 2000s. And I do actually quite like the look of these eMachines PCs. Now, maybe it's just my nostalgia speaking, and it probably is. But I do actually quite like the case design. I think it's quite aesthetically pleasing, or as aesthetically pleasing as a beige box PC tower case can be. And as for Windows Me itself, and before you try and correct me in the comments, it was indeed pronounced Windows Me.
Windows Me is the latest version of Windows for the home user. It's got a number of big advances in areas like digital media, home networking, PC health, and the best online experience. And so for people who want the best out of Windows on their home computer, it's Windows Me.
Although the M and the E were actually initials for Millennium Edition, of course, or as it was known to people that used it back then, Mistake Edition. And it was the final release in the Windows 9X line, released in September of 2000 and discontinued only 11 months later when Windows XP was launched. And its extremely short lifespan, I think, was one of the things that really hurt Windows Me. Windows 2000 was already on the market by the time Windows Me was released, but that of course was a continuation of the Windows NT line, aimed at business and enterprise use, not at the home user. And as Windows XP wouldn't be ready for another year, Microsoft decided to put out one final 9X release to bridge that gap. And as you can see, I do actually have an official Windows Me install CD because, like it says on there, we must not make illegal copies of the disk. And the installer is pretty uneventful, very similar to Windows 98, only with a different colour scheme. And I had Windows XP installed originally on this machine, but if you have 98, you can actually do an upgrade install to Windows Me, but I've gone for the fresh install route here. And tracking down the drivers was actually pretty simple, as this is essentially just an updated version of Windows 98. I found that Windows 98 drivers tended to work just fine for this PC. Now, one thing that really stood out to me compared to Windows 98 is the fast boot time. One of the things that they took out of Windows Me, which is actually one of the reasons it gets a lot of hate, is the real DOS mode. But it does mean that it can boot much faster. And from power on, this old eMachines PC gets to the desktop in around 18 seconds, which is actually pretty much as fast as my modern i7 PC with an SSD running Windows 10. And then we hear that familiar boot sound. If you were a user of Windows 2000, it's actually the same sound in Windows Me. And this was actually always my second favourite Windows boot sound, as it had that kind of real futuristic, dawn of a new millennium sound to it. And in case you are curious about what is my favourite Windows boot sound, it has to be that from NT. Both epic and slightly terrifying at the same time. And the Windows 2000 influence on Windows Me is apparent in other places as well. The icon set and the colour scheme are the same as Windows 2000, and below the hood there are other technologies from 2000 in here as well, including the TCP/IP stack to connect to networks. And when looking at Windows Me and what they were trying to do, it is important to remember the technology landscape in the year 2000, as digital media was really finally becoming a thing at home. It had kind of moved on from the multimedia phase of the mid-90s, which was all about content consumption, and with technology like MP3 players and digital cameras finally making their way into people's homes, it really was the first generation of content creators as we know them today. And Windows Me was really focused on that message, and it was really geared towards it. So that meant we had the inclusion of programs like Windows Movie Maker, which made its debut in Windows Me. And I'll be honest, I haven't actually used Windows Movie Maker since the Windows XP version, but if I actually get some footage and load it into here, the clips that I've been showing you of the Windows Me adverts are actually a WMV file that's bundled on the Windows Me CD. So if I load it into here, you can actually see it is editable, and if indeed very slow, you can edit videos using this. And Windows Me also has wizards everywhere. It can import footage from your camcorder using a wizard, your digital camera. There's a scanner wizard included as well. They really went to big efforts to make it much more user-friendly than Windows 98. And we have the skinnable Windows Media Player 7 at the heart of all of your media to handle your video files and, of course, your MP3 collection, wherever it was you got them from. The media thing really was a huge part of their advertising, and it made sense as it was aimed at the home market back then, as you've got to remember, Microsoft split their products into home and business, with Windows 2000 being the version for corporate use. And one thing that rarely gets a mention when talking about Windows Me is the speed of it. Now, I've already mentioned the boot speed is much improved over Windows 98, but actually, I'm finding when using it here, the entire operating system feels actually very snappy and responsive, even on this limited hardware, with just 128 megabytes of RAM. Now, admittedly, I've not done any in-depth comparisons, but comparing this to using Windows 98 SE on my much more powerful Pentium 4 machine, I've got to say, Windows Me does feel more responsive in comparison. Now, admittedly, it could be down to the fact that this is a much fresher install. I only installed this about a month ago, and my 98 one's been on there for a couple of years, but it certainly feels overall more responsive and faster in use. And these speed comparisons were noted in reviews of the time as well. Now today, we generally only hear bad things about Windows Me, but looking back to when it was released back in 2000, believe it or not, but it did actually review pretty well, receiving a 4 out of 5 score and rated as excellent by PC Mag. And even Windows guru Paul Thurrott called it a ray of hope and said that it offered enough reliability improvements and called it a must-have upgrade for Windows 98 users. So it does kind of seem that that image of Windows Me being like, the worst version of Windows ever has only really come along in more recent years. And many of the things that we know today are included in Windows Me. We've got Windows Update in there, which unfortunately the servers are no longer up, it doesn't work anymore. And we've got System Restore, which made its debut in Windows Me. Now, this is one area that many people complain is really buggy. Now, admittedly, I don't think I've been using Windows Me long enough to have given this a long-term test, but I have tried with a few restore points, and it's actually gone without a hitch. But, that said, I've never really had much luck with System Restore on any version of Windows, including Windows 10. And I can probably count the times that Windows Restore has got me out of trouble on one hand over the last 20 years. Usually, if I get a catastrophic Windows failure or some kind of corruption, that really means I've got to do a full restore manually from a backup. And another security feature of note is System File Protection, also known as Windows File Protection on 2000 and XP, but this was the first time that it made its way into a Windows 9X release. And that means that when you replace or delete a system file that hasn't got a file lock on it to prevent it from getting overwritten, Windows will immediately and silently restore the original copy of that file. Because it actually keeps a copy of all of the core and important files that are installed by default, and what it will do is it will quietly restore them if they get overwritten. So that does mean that a lot of the more malicious viruses that brought down Windows 95 and Windows 98 are less effective when using Windows Me, at least in theory. And we got proper hibernation support built into Windows Me as well, which obviously certain systems could do this on Windows 98 and even Windows 95 if the OEM provided drivers for it, but this was the first time that it was bundled in the box with Windows. Although it was disabled by default, I could turn it on quite simply in the control panel power settings. And things that were included in the Windows 98 Plus pack were bundled out of the box in Windows Me, like the compressed folder support, which obviously was really handy. Now, the two main complaints that I generally see about Windows Me Online is system stability, and I wonder if that really comes down to drivers, because I must admit, having used this machine for the last month, quite regularly actually, I'll be honest, I've yet to have a single crash or a blue screen of death. So it really hasn't been the unstable mess that I was expecting, but obviously reading reports online it seems like your luck may vary. I do actually wonder if a lot of Windows Me's unstable reputation came from people upgrading and installing it over Windows 98 installs back in the day, which may have affected its stability. And the second big complaint is the lack of proper DOS mode. Now, Windows Me is still built on the MS-DOS foundation, but they've removed the option to boot directly into DOS mode. But of course that doesn't mean that it can't run DOS applications. Just like on Windows 98, you could run a DOS app in Windows inside a window, and this actually still works in Windows Me. You can just double click a DOS program from Windows and it will launch inside kind of a virtual DOS emulator if you like. Now doing this has got advantages and disadvantages of course. On the positive side, it means it doesn't require any setting up, and it really is as simple as just double clicking. And secondly, you don't need to mess around with drivers, as things like DOS audio and graphics drivers, Sound Blaster support are all emulated and taken care of. So that does mean that for a lot of DOS games, you will actually find they run pretty well in this mode. Now I know that purist DOS gamers will be hating on me for saying that, but it does work just fine for the games that I've tried on here. But the thing is, of course, it's not real DOS. It's not like on Windows 98 where you could drop into DOS and load your drivers and run things natively. You're not accessing the system resources directly, so of course that does also mean you're not getting the full speed. And I'm sure there are many things that will not work on here, but I've actually had pretty good luck. But I find a lot of the DOS games that I play date from the late 80s and early 90s, but it's actually running them this way been a pretty decent experience, akin to something like DOSBox on Windows 10. But of course, if you do want a DOS gaming machine, Windows Me is certainly not the operating system that you want to be using. Now there are ways to get directly into MS-DOS mode, because it's not actually been removed from Windows Me, it's just kind of been hidden away. And like I mentioned, the OS is still based on DOS, just like Windows 98, and there are patches and guides out there that will allow you to restore this functionality if you really miss it. And obviously it will run all of the Microsoft software from the period just fine. I believe that Office 97 was still the current version of Microsoft Office when this came out, so we can run that, and there we go. We can see our old mate Little Clippy again, or Clippert as he was officially called. And loading files onto Windows Me was surprisingly easier. Now obviously we've got USB support, although this machine has only got USB 1, which was very slow. But I can also access its shared folders and the entire C drive over my local network on my Windows 10 PC, which is quite handy for downloading stuff on my modern machine and transferring it over to the Windows Me box. And of course Windows games from this period that you would have played on Windows 98 run mostly the same on Windows Me, and I thought I'd dig out a few classics that you may have played back in the year 2000. Now Windows Me comes bundled with Internet Explorer 5.5, which of course is hideously outdated now, but there is actually a current-ish web browser available which works with Windows Me. Now I did cover this in my Windows 95 video as well, the fantastic RetroZilla, which works on Windows 95, 98 and Windows Me. And that opens up a lot of the more modern websites to these old machines, as the latest version is from late 2019. Now obviously don't expect to be watching YouTube on here, but for things like forums and basic sites and downloading abandonware software, I find it works pretty well. And despite the bad reputation and name that it's got, believe it or not, there are actually some Windows Me enthusiasts on boards like the brilliant Vogons.org, and there's actually a fantastic guide to fully optimizing Windows Me to run the best that it can by a user on here called Tetrium. And there are even guides and threads from Windows 98 fans who've taken some of the newer parts that are in Windows Me and transplanted them back into Windows 98. So in conclusion, and I must admit I'm almost hesitant to say this because I can already imagine the comments I'm going to get on this video now, but my impressions of Windows Me, having used it on this machine for the last month or so, is, dare I say, surprisingly positive. But maybe only because I was expecting it to be so much worse based on everything I've read about Windows Me online over the last 20 years or so. But I've actually found a reasonably responsive, and on this machine at least, stable version of Windows 9X, which is probably also the downfall of Windows Me. Because it was only on the market for a year before XP was launched, this all feels somewhat pointless. Sure, you'll find a few new features in here, but really there is nothing compelling enough to make you choose it over Windows 98 2nd Edition. And of course, the lack of real DOS mode would be enough to put a lot of people off it. Really, using Windows Me just feels like Windows 98 3rd edition, it really didn't warrant having its own full release as its entire own operating system. So there you go, a little look back at Windows Me. Was it as bad as people made out? I'll be honest, in my opinion, I don't think it is. It just all feels a bit meh to me. But I'd love to know your thoughts. Maybe you used it back in the day. Maybe you've tried it out recently. Maybe after watching this video, you're going to give it a try. Leave me a comment. I would love to know your thoughts. And while you're watching this video, quick heads up that I also do a weekly retro gaming podcast, The Retro Hour, which you can find in any of your favourite podcast clients. Give us a search. New episodes released every Friday, or you can download it directly through the website, theretrohour.com. And while you're here on YouTube, here's another video I think you might enjoy. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.